USA Blue, box, and USA Silver on. First of all, congratulations to both teams making it to the Greenhill Championship. And without further ado, I ask the first proposition to open debate on the motion. Hear, hear.
The globe today is more connected than ever. Yet it seems like in all of our quests to build international community, some nations have forgotten priorities for themselves. It's ultimately to remind them of these priorities in a way that will help not only those nations, but the international community overall, that we are so proud to propose today's motion. This House believes that domestic applicants should be prioritized over international students. So what am I going to do in this speech? First off, I'm going to give you some points on framing to clarify this debate. And then second, I'm going to present our first two substantive arguments. So first off, let's go over framing. For a quick clarification, this is a debate about priorities. The proposition side does not support a world with no international students. Instead, we think both international and domestic students stand to gain by reorganizing the college admissions process in the status quo. We would support a world where domestic applicants simply have a leg up compared to international applicants in the admissions process. So, what is the status quo? We recognize that college admissions takes into account a variety of factors. However, we believe that in our world, a student's national origin would play a significant role. So, with that in mind, let's get into our first two substantive arguments. First off, that the sacrifice of citizens requires preference in admissions processes. Firstly, understand that government support is crucial for universities to operate. For public universities, they're directly owned, operated, and funded by the government. This looks like the UC system and most Chinese and Indian universities, where both state and national governments work together to essentially make sure these universities can continue working and offer education to the people. But the same situation occurs, just with a different framework for private universities. That's because the state and local federal governments are still offering things like research grants, tax privileges, and other benefits that the government can offer to these universities. For example, Princeton University receives about $54,000 annually per student from the government. So, why is this so important? It's because the government support is heavily contingent on citizen sacrifices. The government is paying these universities with citizens' tax money. They're creating laws and regulations to limit these universities, and citizens are abiding to these laws because they want to ultimately receive the goal of admission to a university. Finally, land is taken away from citizens and from the people in general, so the universities can operate and have space to be there. So, the fundamental purpose of this state involvement is to boost education. Thus, citizens make these sacrifices with the expectation that they will at one point be able to access this education. That's where this connects to the motion. Why should citizens gain preference in the admissions process? First off, is because spots are finite. There is a necessary trade-off between international students and domestic students. So, recognizing that domestic students are making these sacrifices, it is simply morally correct to give to domestic students preference in order to pay them back for those sacrifices. But second, at that point, when a domestic candidate meets the standard requisite criteria for admission, their contribution and sacrifice so the university should exist should always be recognized. That's why, on principle, you stand with our side. But next, before I move on to my next substantive argument, I'll take a point of information.
You tell us that it's important for citizens to have equal access to universities because they pay taxes, and they should be prioritized because of it. If that's the case, why don't people who are rich and pay more in taxes are more entitled to that university position who are in domestic situations?
No, so we classify this as a collective obligation. Essentially what happens is that the entire body of a nation works as one body. They are paying these taxes to the government with the expectation that the government offers these same services back to the people. It's not as if you can zero it down onto the individual level and say that one person paid more towards Harvard, so thus they get admission into Harvard. Instead, we're just saying that the people in general act as a body and the government has to recognize that body. So, with that, let's move on to our second substantive argument, protecting vulnerable applicants. Our first layer here is quick clarifications about the status quo. When many international students are accepted, a trade-off exists for low-income or highly marginalized students. Why? It's because to bolster endowments, increase potential for donations, and avoid paying financial aid, colleges always value the wealthy. They ultimately see it as a stronger endgame for their goals to bring in wealthy applicants, because they know that if you bring in the wealthy, you have the opportunity to have a strong alumni base that will continue funding that university. But, on the other hand, international students spend a lot on housing and tuition. What that means is that when they see these international students, they essentially recognize the fact that they have a lot of money to offer and then decide that they should take those applicants with a lot of money instead of domestic applicants that might not have the same opportunities. But why are these international students characterized as having so much money? There's a few reasons. First off, it's because to get accepted into a very high-level university, you have to be proficient in English. In order to get those skills, you normally need some type of tutor or some type of service that you would pay for in order to become proficient in English. At that point, we think that most international students have to be wealthy in their home country. But second, it's because you have to have very good grades. That often means that you have to attend a good private school with a decent amount of connections, because the only way that university is considering your admission is at the point that you meet their admission criteria. In developing nations, meeting that admission criteria often means going to the best of schools, which means you need the best of money. That's why they're at the top of the socioeconomic level. But finally, it's because often you just need to be able to afford tuition before they even accept you. For example, in the United Kingdom, before you can even be accepted as an international student, you have to prove that you can pay at least £12,000 because they consider that the cost of living per year. So, on that assumption, the university pretty much looks at international applicants and decides that the people with the most money and meeting those admission criteria should be admitted. Why is that such a problem? It's because the most vulnerable citizens are cut out of the status quo. Now understand, this is not to say that every international student is rich. It's to say that to meet the criteria to enter these universities, you often have to be at least substantially more well off than everyone else in your country. So, vulnerable citizens that were first off in the same country but just didn't have the same amount of money are now cut out. What do these vulnerable citizens look like? First off, it's people who are historically oppressed by the government. That's an example like African Americans in the United States and indigenous people in Australia who don't have the same socioeconomic levels just because the government has been oppressing them for centuries. Second, it's people that were historically excluded by the university itself. So a lot of times with developed universities, we're talking about institutions that also have a long history of oppressing certain groups. These people are also excluded for that reason. And finally, we're talking about people being neglected in the status quo. That's like primary education being hard to access for people of low socioeconomic status. For those people, they just can't meet the admission criteria because at that point, they don't have the money to get those same statistics. We ensure that those people still get opportunity without their socioeconomic status still getting taken into play. But why does this harm citizens? It's three big ways. First off, it subjugates vulnerable populations and it prevents them from rising because it takes everyone that's not succeeding in the status quo and makes sure that they don't get the opportunities to succeed in the future. Second, it results in admissions overlooking and ignoring them. For example, many schools that try to educate a diverse group of people just take internationals instead. That's like ASU and UCLA. And finally, it results in quality of life changing. Shandong University of Finance and Economics was recently revealed to have moved an entire group of domestic students into 8-person dorms just so that they could situate international students in 1-person dorms, since those international students were able to pay so much. Ultimately, it's because we believe socioeconomic status should not define everything in terms of education that we are so proud to propose.
those remarks, and I invite the opposition to open up opposition's case. Hear, hear.
A child who's born female in Afghanistan is more likely to get sexually assaulted as a child than she is to ever receive an education. Just a few hundred miles away in nations like Pakistan or India, your prospects increase or decrease significantly. It's fundamentally because side opposition believes that the lottery of birth is not an equitable way of determining someone's entire future that we are proud to oppose. Over the course of this speech, I'll be doing a few things. First, I'll be starting by refuting the First, I'll start by clarifying the framework. Second, I'll address some of side opposition's arguments. And third and finally, I'll propose the first 2 of 3 substantive arguments that side opposition will be going over. But first, the framing. We agree to most of the proposition's framing with one critical caveat. We think that education is more than just a tool that nations use to get a new workforce or to get productivity out of people. On side opposition, we believe that education is intrinsically valuable, that it's also a means of self-actualization. That's why we believe that the obligation to provide an education transcends things like national divides or international divides. With that being said, let's move on into addressing the proposition case, starting with their first point. There's a few critical flaws in this. Though it talks about the sacrifice of citizens, first, observe that under this logic, as correctly pointed out in the point of information, this means that if you pay more for systems through taxes, you are more entitled to getting in. Roby tries to counter this by saying that everyone in a nation pays as a collective, but the fact is that we don't admit students as a collective, we admit students as individuals. If you truly believe that however much you pay is however much you're entitled to get in, then you would endorse the rich getting in at a much more disproportionate rate. Second, we have to understand that oftentimes international students are capable of paying just as much or more and giving more to the university's resources. That means the financial burden isn't only swept to the people of that nation. Third, we have to understand that the sacrifice that people of other nations made is colonialism. Because so many other nations underwent subjugation by the nations that these universities are located in, they are entitled to get access to these because the very reason their economics or their economy isn't productive and the reason that they don't have quality universities is because of colonization. And fourth and finally, we have to understand that education is once again intrinsically valuable. Even if you buy nothing that I've just said, if you truly believe that people have to get an education to fulfill their own potential, then you would understand that the obligation to give education is more important than the obligation of nations. Next, let's go on to their second point, which talks about low-income students. First of all, understand that for all their rhetoric, side proposition doesn't solve the problem. The reason for this is the alternative to rich international students is not poor domestic students. The alternative to rich international students is rich domestic students. I'll take your point in a second. The problem with this argument is that if you even go with their reality, the low-income students who require access to these universities are getting that. If the students, or rather the school's goal really is their bottom line endowment, they have no solvency. I'll take your point.
Taking the richest, most successful, and also the smartest individuals from previously colonized states is a form of neocolonialism in and of itself.
That's not entirely true, because as we would contend, the vast majority of people who get an education abroad end up coming back to their nation to better it. With that in mind, we have one final response against this point, and that's the fact that the language barrier doesn't always apply. For example, Senegal, which once used to be a colony of France now speaks French. As a result of that, you can apply in French to French schools. The only reason for giving the citizens of France priority over people from Senegal would be that colonialization argument. It wouldn't be the argument on merit. As a result, this argument is incredibly short-sighted and narrow-minded. Don't buy this. With that in mind, let's go forward into establishing the opposition's case, starting with our first point. Discrimination based on arbitrary characteristics is inherently unjust. The principle here is that even though there are many different varieties of admission, different factors that we have to consider, using where you were born as a source of admission is incredibly unjust, because everyone has fundamental worth irrespective of their nationality, color, or creed. If you are denying students based on these factors, you're essentially saying that they deserve less just because of the borders in which they happen to be born. Second, we have to understand that there's a lottery of birth. People who happen to be Sudanese or Indian don't intrinsically deserve less rights than people who happen to be British or American. If you truly believe that education is something that people require irrespective of nationality, you'll understand that our right to an education transcends nationality. And third and finally, we have to understand that side proposition constitutes active discrimination. Why is this? Because they make decisions based off of this. It isn't just one tangential factor. That is the definition of racism. That is the definition of oppressing the people who are already down. The second point that we're going to establish is how you improve the lives of international students over on side opposition. There's a few parts of this. Subpoint A is that an education lets their students better serve the country. Here's where James is wrong in his previous point of information, because we observe that the vast majority of students who end up getting an education domestically don't stay and don't try to leave the country. They end up staying. In fact, 80% of students who leave China to study end up coming back and benefiting the nation. This is incredibly important because in underdeveloped nations like Zimbabwe or India, the biggest barrier to education isn't a lack of motivation. The biggest barrier to education is the fact that those resources don't exist altogether. And these resources don't start to exist unless educated students from these other nations come back and help develop the country. In other words, side proposition would constitute a world where there is no fundamental solvency. Second, they need opportunities. It's incredibly difficult to pursue a STEM field when your home nation doesn't have access to computers. Here we would say that if you wanted to develop fields in these different types of nations, the prerequisite is then going and developing those skills internationally. And third and finally, we understand that side proposition would construe these nations into a catch-22. Because in order to develop an education, you need educated students. But under side proposition's thesis, the vast majority of students would not be able to access this type of an education because they don't have the ability to go and study abroad under the criteria proposed by side proposition. Understand that the counterfactual, what side opposition is doing, is what benefits the countries in the long term because it rescues the home nations of these individuals from the catch-22. I'll take your point.
At what point is your side proving that these people get an education and then come back and actually build education sectors?
Right, so I would contend that the prerequisite to universities, developed industries, or even getting access to things like computers is people who are well versed in this technology. You guys don't allow for that to happen, therefore you don't build up education systems. This has benefits for both the countries that students are studying in because intuitively when these students come back, they're able to best benefit the economy. But it also has benefits for the host nation because international affairs aren't actually a zero-sum game. We observe this in a few ways. First of all, by better developing the the countries that they originally came from, they improve the economy of these nations and as a result improve trade relationships. But second, we understand that education fundamentally also makes countries more stable. It was Malala Yousafzai who once said, with guns you can kill terrorists, but only with an education can you kill terrorism. If we want to address conflict in some of the most unstable parts of the world, the prerequisite is an educated workforce who's capable of moving these regions forward. That doesn't happen in the side of the proposition. In summary, the opposition is a few things. It's giving people access to the opportunities that they're fundamentally due by virtue of their birth. It's developing countries that in the status quo don't actually have the chance to develop. And finally, it's all the other countries in the world reaping these benefits when it comes back to benefit them through means like international trade and international stability. As a result, I couldn't be more proud to oppose.
I thank the opposition speaker for those remarks, and I invite the second proposition to continue debate the opposition's case.
In his first speech, Arham tells you the story of a young female in Afghanistan who is deeply disenfranchised and has long been subjugated. What their side of the house fails to recognize is that this young female, who has been historically neglected, yes, was never the type of individual who was ever accepted into an international student anyway. The difference on our side of the house is that by allowing international students to improve the education systems within their nation of origin, all people benefit. This is the case in which the young girl finally has access to education. This speech will be very simple. First, an analysis of what's been happening on the principal level of debate, then practical, and finally a discussion of side oppositions to substantive arguments. But let's start off on the principle, because we thought there was a lot of material here that really needed to be put into conversation with itself. Basically, they give you this argument about the lottery of birth, and they say arbitrary characteristics should never be the determining factor of whether or not a person is successful. Note, though, that this is the extent of their analysis. They don't tell you what types of arbitrary characteristics are more dangerous than others. What we would say is that on our side of the house, we recognize
that nation of origin is a type of arbitrary characteristic, but so is socioeconomic status.
Point.
But what we would say is that socioeconomic status is a more important arbitrary characteristic in the context of college admissions, because an education for someone who has been historically left behind and not had the ability to proliferate themselves economically is going to gain much more social mobility from an education than a student who is rich. Note, Rohit gave you a lot of structural analysis in our second substantive argument that told you precisely why students are likely to be rich. He told you, A, that in order to even be able to be considered for a particular university, they're probably going to have a baseline level of academic proficiency. This means, for a lot of countries, you have to attend the best private schools. You have to have hired a tutor to get your standardized test scores up. And in fact, they ignored the fact that in England, you have to prove that you have £12,000 just for your first year to live in the country. They give you no reason as to why students actually have the realistic opportunity of making conditions better for themselves. On our side of the house, though, we said that we prioritize students who are struggling economically in the nation of origin. These are the students who, because there is a finite number of spots, are able to now get acceptance to university and use that education to make themselves more economically stable. What was our comparable material? What we told you is that the specific sacrifices with citizens with respect to the college admissions process basically indicates that they should have preference in the admissions process. What did they say? They basically said that by our logic, rich people who pay more taxes should have more of a preference in the admissions process. Note, this was not what Rohit told you. What we are saying is that in the case that taxes are progressive, a burden, which is basically proportional to your economic level of stability, is being placed on you as a citizen in order for the existence of the educational institution to happen. This means that because you are making a sacrifice, whether or not it matters the number of dollars that you give up, you are justified in having a claim to a spot. But they secondly say that international students have a claim to these spots because of things like them paying tuition. Note the very nuanced principal distinction here. On our side of the house, citizens are basically being coerced into giving up their money to the government by taxes in order to achieve the end of education. International students are making a decision to pay tuition to a particular school in order to get an education. In this case, we say that the only reason why it is justified to take away these citizens' autonomy is if they can reasonably expect they're going to benefit from the system they are sacrificing to produce. That was the analysis we thought that they missed on their side of the house. But now let's analyze this debate on the practical level. But I will take your point before I do so.
You say that the reason that people have a just claim to the education system is the act of sacrificing. Then does me paying a college application fee, the act of sacrificing money, give me just claim to equal consideration in admissions?
It wasn't just that we said you sacrificing gives you preference in the admission process. What we said is that the specific sacrifices you are making, taxes, land in the country that you live in, mean that you should have access to the benefits those sacrifices are going to produce. It was very specific that those sacrifices necessitated those benefits. But like I said, let's move on to the practical level. Essentially, what they told you here was that international students are going to be going back to their countries and serving them and helping them become more economically successful. A couple of responses here. The first is that they gave you an incentive analysis, not a structural analysis. They gave you a lot of reasons why students would want to study abroad and go back to their home countries. What we are telling you is that there are realistic reasons why this is not structurally possible, because the only case in which you're going to be able to leave your country is if you are already wealthy. That means that even if a student with a lower economic status wanted to leave, they would not physically have the resources to do so, because in the majority of cases, it's very hard to get scholarships. What we would say is that in the case in which a student with less money was accepted to an international student, if they are correct and the education system is so bad and basically the circumstances of the country are so bad, why would they return? The same is true of richer students. If they can get more opportunities elsewhere, why would they return? They are not able to access their impacts on any level of debate. But let's also discuss what happened on our comparable material. What we told you is that there is a necessary trade-off between the number of international students that can be accepted and the number of domestic students, and that as such, they are likely to be cutting out the most vulnerable domestic applicants in favor of richer international students who might ordinarily be successful in their country anyway. Essentially, they said that low-income students, there's no reason why low-income students would suddenly be admitted to universities. We have two responses to this. The first of which is that the physical decrease in the number of spots that exist mean that statistically, lower-income students are less likely to be admitted. But more so, in many cases, these low-income students don't apply in the first place, even if they're qualified, because they know there's such stringent competition from richer domestic and international students. That's the thing that they never responded to in our case. But that being said, I'd like to move on to our third substantive argument, which is on why prioritizing citizens benefits the international community. Note, we are introducing a new stakeholder with this argument. We want to prioritize the students who are in international countries who never had the opportunity to leave like their richer counterparts, because ultimately they are one of the most vulnerable people in this debate. Why do we think that we're creating better education systems internationally? Let's characterize the status quo. Right now, governments are extremely complacent with respect to education because if a student does decide to return to their nation of origin after getting an education internationally, they have fulfilled the need of a specific type of education. So for example, in India, a lot of the focus is on STEM education, science education, and math education. The reason why this is an economically viable structure is because when international students go abroad, they are able to get the skills of liberal arts and bring them back to the Indian economy. That means that the government has no incentive to actually build up their liberal arts education so that everyone can access it. Why does this change on our side of the house? Two levels of incentives. First, governments understand that the stability of their workforce is premised on the ability to have a very diverse sector of markets, meaning that they need workers that have a lot of high skills in a lot of different industries. When they recognize they are not able to do that as much as they can in the status quo, they are more likely to build that up with government funds. Oftentimes, they're able to reallocate their budget to make this possible. But additionally, the incentives of rich students, even like assuming the governments didn't have money, are to have a good education. Rich students want to be able to have access to different types of education, so they are likely to establish their own universities in their country's origin. Why do we think it's so likely that they would make it in their own country? Because moving abroad is an extremely disruptive process. You have to sacrifice your social ties. You have to sacrifice your relationship with your family. You have to leave the place that you've known all your life and that you call home. But the thing is, not only rich students stand to gain from this system. This means that when there was no physical existence of schools for lower income students that didn't have the resources to leave, they are now able to get acceptance into these education institutions, and then the entire country is able to access a more proficient and robust education, for which reason I'm very proud to propose.
Thank you for those remarks, and I invite the opposition to continue the opposition's case.
On side proposition, they would like to expand education in those home countries and give education to everybody. However, what they fail to explain in any of their speeches is how that process actually works. Just because you have intelligent people staying in your nation doesn't mean that suddenly the government has the ability nor the resources to open up these educational institutions without the exchange of ideas that you get from universities abroad as a baseline. Perhaps their world would work if the governments weren't having economic issues, perhaps underdeveloped infrastructure and such. But that's a situation we're dealing with, and that's why people are leaving. They need to tell us the link of how these education systems actually get started up just because now people want to go to university in their home countries. We think that the exchange of ideas is necessary, and the only way you can achieve that is allowing these people to go to international universities and bring back the knowledge and then getting the resources through the link of economy. We don't think they can do that. We don't think they have solvency on their side of the house. I'll do a couple things in my speech today. Firstly, provide clarification on how the college process actually works and what criteria current admissions uses. Secondly, go down your case and defend our material. And third, provide my substantive on why it's so important to have international integration in universities. So firstly, how does the admissions criteria actually work? On their side of the house, there's a false dichotomy that it's either socioeconomic status or just international students. However, realize that socioeconomic quotas will always exist. The problem and the question that we need to solve in this debate is within those specific income brackets and already established quotas, how do we pick who to come from, like where they come from and such? That is the debate. This debate is not about the trade-off between poor domestic students and rich international students. This debate is about rich domestic students and rich international students within the specific income pool and who we should accept. So on their side house, don't let them convince you that there's actually a trade-off between these rich international students and poor domestic students, and later I will expand this in my speech. So now let's go down their case. Their main principled argument is about idea of sacrifice and how spots are finite and you need to earn your place, and the domestic students have more of a right because you sacrifice your taxpayer dollars and such. However, they don't adequately respond in their second speech about the colonialism argument that we bring up in our very first speech. The reason why they have to leave their country in the first place is because of colonialism, is because the host nations of those good universities right now took advantage of them and resulted in them not having the resources nor ability to actually continue this. James tried to preempt this in his POI by saying that it's still neo-colonialism if you only accept the rich people of those nations. However, we have three responses to this. Firstly, realize the victors of colonialism often were also pushed into it at the same time. Often when you live in that type of situation, you don't have a choice whether or not to succeed in your nation or not. So we think that this choice was inherently coercive and they had to make it. Therefore, you can't just say that they're victors of colonialism and say that they weren't oppressed. But secondly, we would also argue that even if you were a victor of colonialism under this type of circumstance, it doesn't mean you didn't go through the hardship and oppression of that colony, right? We think under these type of circumstances, your social ties were likely messed up, your nation was likely not doing well and is not doing well right now. Therefore, we think it still grants them the ability and the right to be at these international institutions. But third, realize that on our set house, it's much more likely that we actually expand the international applicant pool to people of lower socioeconomic statuses in these host nations. On their set house, when you limit this pool, we think that's when the colleges are more likely to only accept the most elite at these nations and not even want to open these pools up because, like they said, they want money and such. So on our grounds, we think that we still fulfill their criteria and prove to you that these students have the right, considering the only reason why they're leaving is because of the oppressive nature of colonialism and such. Now, secondly, they also don't adequately respond to our argument about, to our point out in their flaws in their first sub about how taxpayer dollars necessarily means that more people should have more of a chance if they pay more money. They try to respond to this by saying that no, it's a collective and it's just like a principled exchange. However, we would argue otherwise. If your criteria for deserving a right is how much you contribute to the preservation of these institutions, then we would argue on their set house, they also have to defend rich individuals who pay more taxes getting more of a chance, considering you're the one apparently upkeeping more and better of these institutions because you're paying more taxpayer dollars in order for the government to actually allocate more resources and making the colleges better in turn, therefore granting them this type of opportunity. So we think they can't just skirt that on their set house, they also just have to defend it that way if this is their principle. Now, thirdly, we would like to touch on the issue of money and how the college admission process works in respect to socioeconomic statuses. We would argue that the harms on their set house are symmetrical, right? Just because you don't accept rich international students doesn't mean the colleges still don't want money. So the difference here is that you don't get rich international students, but now you're more inclined to admit domestic rich students anyway. So under their world, then that characterization, we don't think anything changes in terms of socioeconomic diversity, considering that the choice you have to make is between a foreign rich student and a domestic rich student, which means that they actually don't meet the goal of diversifying socioeconomics on their side of the house either. And we have already proven to you and explained that the pools are indeed separate, so the rich international student is not stealing from the poor domestic student, and in fact even helping their education. Because considering they're in different pools, and these international students, like they said, are usually more affluent and wealthy and are able to provide funds to the college, these funds are directly put into the poor domestic students' education to fund these scholarships and such. We think that there's no direct trade-off here and we only get the benefits on our side of the house. They don't have that on their side of the house when they only admit rich domestic students anyway. They don't show us how that changes. Sure.
Look, colleges have diversity quota. If they're getting that diversity quota from international students, they have severely less an incentive to admit minority students that need it much more domestically.
But realize that quotas are going to exist on either sides of the house, right? Most of the time, diversity quotas are not based entirely in the pool. It's like a subcategory within the quotas of socioeconomic status. We would argue in the majority of cases, socioeconomic status is one of the first categorizations the college admissions process does to the applicant pool, and then within those pools they will fill out different diversity quotas. So we think on their set house, if they were to decrease the amount of international students accepted in the rich pool, then that inevitably still means that they have to accept rich people, just not internationally, which means the harms are symmetrical on their side as well. Now lastly, we would like to touch on the idea of actually bolstering education in the home nations, and this is also playing into my extension on how necessarily we actually promote education better in these nations. The problem with their solution here is that they never quite explain how staying in your nation automatically means that you'll suddenly have the funds, the resources, the capital to start better educational institutions. We think on our side of the house, when you go abroad internationally and then come back to your home country simply because you want to be with your family or simply because you want to develop your home nations better, we think that it's the likelier chance that on our side of the house, you have the capital, the resources, and the knowledge to actually do this. On their side of the house, just because you stay in your home nation and attempt to bolster the educational system doesn't mean it'll necessarily happen. It's severely underexplained on their side of the house, while on our side of the house, there's an exchange of ideas. You take the higher education abroad, you bring it back home, and then you bolster the economy the same way. When you bring knowledge, when you bring technology, etc., that's when the government will have the ability as well as the resources to open up these institutions that eventually help more people. So on our side of the house, we're the ones that actually promote education for the majority of the world, not them because they never explain how. Very proud to oppose.
I think the opposition speaker for those remarks, and I'd like the opposition speaker to give a response. Really good.
Sorry, the timer has switched to like 15 minutes a clock instead of working. Side opposition fundamentally misses the core in today's debate. When we recognize that colleges obviously cannot accept every single applicant around the world, and most importantly, they fail to specifically counter our characterization of what the types of international students being admitted look like. They try to champion those who are the most vulnerable, champion those who have the least opportunity, and champion those who are the least privileged internationally. We told you this in the first speech, it is the least likely scenario that these individuals are the ones actually getting into international universities. The most likely trade-off is you get the richest, most already privileged international students taking spots away from the least privileged domestic students. That's the real trade-off you see in today's debate. Three things. Firstly, I want to go over, two things. Firstly, I want to go over just a response to the third substantive argument, and the second is I want to cover the two key clashes we see in today's debate. The first being the principled clash on the government's obligation versus the idea of like a lot of their birth, and the second being the practical clash, who is best for education in general in today's debate, and upholding the systems of education that we both want to improve in the developing countries and in the developing world. But with that, a direct response to their third substantive argument about international integration. Advocates do a lot of analysis how when individuals are to see international students, they're probably going to gain a worldview, gain a lot more appreciation for this culture. I don't think that's necessarily true. In the United States specifically, when we see international students, it probably incentivizes a lot more backlash than it does assimilation or liking or appreciating the culture. The reason being, when they see an international student taking the spot away from them, their family member or their friend, they're far more likely to react in a negative way, far more likely to perceive that international student as bad, and far more likely to push the government to admit less of these students. So even by their own mechanism, this argument just doesn't seem true and doesn't seem like something that we can support. With that, what is the first clash that I want to talk about? It's the principled clash of this debate. I think there's been a lot of analysis on both sides of the bench, but I'm going to break down to you exactly why we win that clash. Recognize, under both sides of today's debate, you can't admit every single person that goes to college. Side opposition also makes an arbitrary sacrifice in today's debate that they're unwilling to claim, but we say that they do. The first being that the international students they admit are the wealthiest or the most privileged within their country. We gave you specific reasons to why this characterization was true that were ultimately refuted. These were that they have to learn languages of the host country, like English or sometimes Chinese, but most of the time Western languages that aren't taught domestically. Secondly, to get the best form of education, to get into international universities, you have to attend already the best schools. Thirdly, literally in some countries, they will not accept you unless you are able to both pay the tuition and the living costs of that nation itself. That characterization proves they were ultimately unable to prove to us how the poorest or the most underprivileged international students do get access on their house. Insofar as this is true, this is also a form of socioeconomic discrimination that they link into, meaning they're making the arbitrary decision to admit the richest or the most privileged international students, not all international students. I think the second arbitrary decision that they had to make was admitting more international students inherently sacrifices the needs of poor domestic students. Really quickly, before I weigh this argument, I want to prove why we ultimately prove there is a trade-off between international students and the students that they're international students and domestic students. They tell us there's a minority, domestic students aren't necessarily cut because they kind of operate under separate niches. For example, if an international student is incredibly rich, that probably doesn't mean a poor domestic student is going to be cut. But we give you 3 specific responses to this that were adequately addressing what they said. The first was that, quite literally, more international spots means less domestic spots. In places like Australia, over 40% of the students going to university are international students. In England, it's in the high 35%. That incentive basically means because there's just fundamentally less spots open, a certain amount of domestic underprivileged students have to be cut. But the second is actually more in the root of the problem. International or domestic students who are poor are less likely to actually apply to these colleges in the first place, as they see massive amounts of international students getting in. That is independent upon any of the economic analysis that we're giving you about what the quotas for colleges are, because it proves as long as they see more international students being admitted, they're probably not going to apply. That probably decentivizes them from getting the education in the first place. But the third is the most important. Abby tries to claim this argument by saying there are quotas on both sides in today's debate, so we ultimately don't win the argument. The problem is, yes, there are quotas in both sides of today's debate. However, on their side, they sacrifice the quota of the least privileged domestic students in today's round. The reason being, those individuals are likely going to be cut out of the system where the colleges ultimately believe they have met their diversity quota by admitting enough international students. They have met that quota and don't need to cater to those domestic students. Furthermore, we think this is a likely trade-off, because if the quota is just about diversity, they want to pick the richer student, not the one that doesn't pay tuition. Go.
James, you made the incentive analysis for yourself. Colleges want bigger endowments. So if they don't choose the high-paying international students, why would they not choose the equally high-paying domestic students, not the poor ones?
So even if we buy this to be true, colleges can pick the incredibly rich international students and incredibly rich domestic students under your side, and you claim that colleges want those endowments so much. With that, I'm going to weigh the importance of the arguments in today's debate. Recognize, an education for a poor domestic student promotes much more social mobility than an education for a rich international student. The reason being, if I'm a person in poverty, I can use that education to get myself a high-skilled job and to break the cycle of poverty that I currently have within my family domestically. But if I'm an already rich international student, I am unable to use that for as much social mobility, in the sense that if I am able to get a good job either way, or get a good education either way, the social mobility you gain from that education is not as much as you get on our side of the house. With that, what is the much better criteria we gave you? Aside from all of this, recognize the fact that our point about how fundamentally governments don't have an obligation to citizens that aren't their own still stands. Our characterization of this was not only that these individuals about taxes or how citizens have to pay money, it was about the inherent obligation the government has to their citizens when they live within that country, when they have land within that country, when they pay taxes in the country. They only respond to the monetary form of the argument, not the whole. We fundamentally take the principle. With that, who is best for education in today's round? Their link into ultimately bettering overall education systems was that these individuals are able to come back and better their own country. One example of this was how 80% of Chinese students go back to China, which I argue is probably not the best example if you want to uphold the least privileged countries with the worst education systems, considering that China is probably pretty strong economically, and there are strong incentives for Chinese students to go back. But if they want to access the real heart of this argument, we're talking about the least privileged countries with no education system that is properly developed, and that also has a large poverty rate. We're the only side that truly maintains that narrative. The reason being, the first thing is that you can use your own analysis against them. The horrible poverty-stricken areas that they were talking about with no education system fundamentally disincentivizes those individuals from coming back. But secondly, let's be more charitable with them and say people do come back. Their best case scenario is when which individuals do come back to their home country, but are only able to either benefit themselves or create some type of industry within a few of their people, right? Say 50% of people from this one country go back after receiving education in the United States. They're able to not do a lot in terms of bettering the education system as a whole. We gave you really good incentive analysis at this point that fundamentally wasn't responded to. The incentive was that when these countries now are seeing the fact that these international students are having to live within their domestic students have to stay within their country, there's a unique obligation and incentive to improve those domestic education systems, because there's fundamentally no alternative for them. That incentive means there's much more government obligation, much more government willpower to improve those education systems. We would tell you fundamentally on their side, at best they get marginal change. On our side, you fundamentally change the way and the course of those education systems in general, which both sides want to promote. We are proud to oppose.
Thank you for those remarks, and I invite the opposition to give a response.
Okay, is everyone ready? I'm going to be exploring two themes in this speech. First, the idea of the principle, and second, the idea of comparative education systems. Both will prove to you overwhelmingly opposition has taken this round. But first, let's examine the principle debate. The best argument we get under this question is the idea that since you tax people, that act of sacrificing means that you have a just claim to equal consideration under that college. Why is this actually a losing strategy for side proposition? Because I asked Liana and Akia why, if sacrificing, irrespective of quantity of that sacrifice, as they claim, is the reason why you have a just claim to equal consideration under a college, why is it then that whenever international students pay the common application fee for their college, they do not have a claim to equal consideration under that college? They have sacrificed an amount of money to be directly paid into those institutions. In fact, we would say that this claim is more important than their claim of paying directly to the government. Why is that so? Because it's more direct. You're sacrificing directly to the college, not sacrificing to the state, which is just an indirect redistribution of those funds. We would tell you specifically because that international students have an equal claim to consideration under their own principle. But second, even if you don't buy that response, we gave you this really in-depth argument about colonialism, about a reparative principle that exists within today's world. They just said, oh no, wait a second, the people who applied to international schools from former colonies were then themselves the neo-colonials and the colonizers. The problem with this argument, even if we accept it at face value, is that not everyone within a country was like a colonizer or supported the colonizer. So even if the top 1% supported the colonizers, that doesn't matter because under our world, you allow the top 10% to apply and get into those countries. You allow the top 10% to benefit after that system of colonialism. They don't contest that the reparative principle exists, just that they don't want the people who benefited off of colonialism getting it. Insofar as Abby and myself both showed you that people have suffered from the extent of colonialism and still have that just claim to that colonialism, we beat this argument. But what was our comparable principle? We told you this idea about the lottery of birth. This is a winning argument for side opposition. What does proposition say in response to it? They say that insofar as all characteristics are arbitrary, socioeconomic status is more important. No. Here's the thing. Colleges must judge on socioeconomic criteria. Why? Because it's the only characteristic of their applicants that just directly links into how they're able to function. Colleges have to have money in order to function. This is what Abby explained to you in their speech. This is why these applicants are viewed in separate pools. Let's view directly for a second why people get into colleges and how that actually happens, because that's been a point of contention that side opposition has been trying to clear up. First, on the idea of wealth. Considering we've already explained to you that wealth is determinant to how a college is able to function, they have to judge on that criteria of wealth. So they might split it into two pools. One group that needs financial aid and one group that doesn't and therefore can subsidize other financial aid. Abby gave you this material in her opposition too, whenever we told you that they are evaluated fundamentally as different. That is to say, the wealthy domestic students are evaluated in comparison to the wealthy international students, and the poorer international students are considered in direct contention with the domestic students. Under our world, that distinction of domestic international is taken away. In their world, it is not. That is why there is not a direct trade-off between rich international students getting in or poor. But even if that were the case, note that that also exists on their side of the house, because they tell you that international students are still going to get in to a certain extent on their side of the house. So they're still willing to accept that trade-off because they don't want to ban all international students if it is only the rich that gets in. But if their incentive analysis is wealth, then they could also take 100% rich domestic students. This is a POI that Rohit gave you. We told you that colleges have the incentive to take in poorer students because they want the diversity within their campus. What did they say in response to this? Oh no, let's evaluate things like diversity quotas because colleges care about having minority representation. So taking someone from like Nigeria means that you can't take a black student in the United States. This is not how diversity quotas work. The experiences of one minority group are different from the experiences of another minority group. That's how quotas work because they want to get as many different experiences in the college as they can to promote that sort of discourse. That is why our side is uniquely better because instead of getting only international students from China or only the rich international students from China, you also get people from places like Eswatini, Senegal, places like that. But our side uniquely addresses that better. Why is this the reason that you have to vote for us? This idea of the lottery of birth now that we've analyzed that this is what we should analyze. Because people cannot control where they are born. Colleges are actively discriminating based off of what your passport says. This is something that colleges decide directly. Admission process is a choice. This is the only impact in the entire round that you can be 100% certain of. That if you vote for side opposition, you are ending this voluntary discrimination against this group. Second of all, we would tell you there's a very substantial burden. This is my new weighing analysis. You should err on the side of justice and equality whenever you are enacting a form of discrimination. This builds on the analysis that Rohit told you in our first speech. On to our second question, which is on the theme of comparative education. I'd just like to analyze this very simply with the process of going through college and coming back home, because it seems that it's gotten a bit muddled. But first, let's analyze how people, if they're accepted into international schools, are able to leave their home, because this is a high barrier that they say. They tell you two things. First, they tell you the idea of a language barrier. I mean, this is pretty presumptuous. Not every good school in the world speaks only English. Rohit gave you the example of former colonies of France, Arnold gave you the example of former colonies in France, for example, Senegal, Tunisia, going to French colleges because that is the language that they speak as a result of their colonialism. In fact, it could have been entirely possible that they spoke a different language, but now they can't and are chained to the French language. We would say that that's an active reason why they should be able to go into those French schools. But second, we would tell you that the comparative on their side is so much worse. The comparatives at schools are more expensive on their side of the house if they have to stay within their home countries, because they themselves advocate for new schools being created, which means that since they're untested, they have to up the tuition of those schools because they are unestablished. We would tell you that cost is less on our side of the house. But the next thing we have to analyze is why people after they graduate college are necessarily going to come back. Before that, I'll take your point, Rohit. Oh, James.
At what point would it be a bad thing for us to create schools and the opportunity in the first place? Like, why is it uniquely bad that we have schools even if they are expensive?
The problem with this is that your entire case is predicated on the idea that people have access to education. Insofar as you create schools that are monumentally more expensive, that is the point at which you do not access the equality that you talk about. I'll talk about that more in a second. Here's why people go back to their country. We get a pretty flippant response that people don't want to go back to their home countries because they're impoverished. We would tell you, no, people love their homes. It is a sacrifice to leave their families. They want to go back and correct the experiences that they themselves have to face. But why then are they entirely likely to change their system? They're likely to return to those countries. And whenever they do, using their experience and knowledge and getting jobs, they're going to have students that are better educated and create a bigger economy. Only whenever you have that economy and that knowledge of good education systems can you create an infrastructure which creates good schools within those home countries. Their side literally tells you to start from ground zero. We would tell you that that's not possible. Their example of India is an example for our side, because it's only after India got educated abroad and could use those technology centers back at their home. Why does this mean we win? Because we don't use borders as a cage for students to stay in and say, hey, you should fend for yourself and create a new education system. This way is extremely clear. The lottery of birth is for us. Please vote opposition.
I think speaking for those remarks, and I invite the opposition to play for the opposition bench. Here.
Liana and I started this round with the analysis of Afghani women. But after this debate, it's become increasingly clear that the proposition would not only condemn this Afghani woman to a reality with no education, they would also foster a reality where none of her descendants would be able to get education either. The way I'm going through this speech is incredibly simple. I'll be analyzing both the status quo and principles of education on their side of the debate, and then analyzing the status quo of education on our side of the debate. Let's start with theirs. First of all, we observe that they have to have incentive analysis. One of James's biggest arguments in this speech, and one of the theses of the proposition, is that if you don't allow international students to come in, somehow it is rich, or rather poor domestic students that take that place. That isn't true. The very incentive analysis that James and Rohit give you with is that colleges want to bolster their bottom line. They want to make sure that their endowments are the biggest they can get. And unfortunately, poor students don't fulfill those burdens. It is rich domestic students that are the counterpart to rich international students. So even taking them at their best case scenario under their own incentive analysis, they don't end up winning this point. But second, we can use this argument against them. I would argue that the vast majority of the time, the reason that poor international students don't apply to colleges is because side proposition is the status quo. Right now, these international students are discriminated against when applying to college. They don't feel the need to apply when they already know they won't get in. Only under the opposition world do we turn this. Second, we have to understand that when they're talking about Second, we have to understand one critical flaw in their side of the debate, and that's something that Rohit brings up in his very first speech. He says in framing that he is not opposed to some international students getting into schools, he just wants to decrease that number. Let's think for a moment. If there are some international students getting in, but less than today, it's not going to be poor international students getting in, it's going to be richer ones. Rohit still leaves an avenue for the wealthiest individuals in these countries to flee their nation and go to other educational systems. This delinks the entirety of their case for a few reasons. First of all, if the richest individuals in other nations are still able to leave, leaving the poorest behind, there is no incentive for the people who have power and money in these nations to actually revamp the education system. Un makes this analysis really clear, and I think this is the final nail in the coffin for opposite propositions having any solvency whatsoever. Second, we have to understand the incentive analysis. When there are international rich students that are still able to leave, albeit in smaller number, you solve none of the problems with the reality of education and reparative purposes. You don't get any of the principled arguments about how people who pay into the system have a right to get into those schools, because you're still prioritizing these students who don't pay taxes. Their own principles are crumbling up underneath them. But second, I want to take a really close look at our world, starting with the principles of education. One point that goes entirely unresponsive by the proposition is the idea that education has intrinsic worth. We use education not only as a tool to get work done, but to allow people to fulfill their full potential. This transcends national boundaries, and this is why the obligation to give an education is only fulfilled under the opposition world. They have not responded to this, and they have lost the spirit of education. But second, we have to talk about bettering the system. Un makes this really clear, and all I can do is cement her analysis, because there are prerequisites to schools bettering their system within their own domestic nations. You can't just get people to go in and say, hey, I'm going to make a school. You need to better their economy, you need to get stability, and you need people to understand how to do stuff like computer science that might not exist within the school. The prerequisite to all of these is an international education. Without that, there is no stability, there is no economic mobility in these nations, and there is no development of other educational systems. Therefore, for the sake of both the principle and the practicalities of education, the only vote that makes sense is a vote for the opposition. Please oppose.
I thank the opposition speaker for those remarks, and I invite the opposition reply to close out the entire debate as a whole. Hear, hear.
For the entirety of this debate, Team Opposition has not only mischaracterized international students, has not only mischaracterized international countries, but they've mischaracterized our analysis as well. I want to go through this debate and explain to you why on every single metric, our side comes out on top. First off, let's talk about the principal argumentation. They argue that the lottery of birth is bad, and ultimately that because of that reason, against all else, you should still vote for their side. But Liana explained in her speech that this lottery of birth still exists in both worlds, but it's worse when it's based on socioeconomic status. That is the voting point on this entire issue. When it's based on socioeconomic status, you prefer our side because at least we can deal with that lottery of birth. But even more so than that, when you take their analysis on its best ground, James still weighted against ours and proved to you that on principle, when you're helping people of low socioeconomic status, you're ultimately doing more to change the social structures of a nation, and you're doing more to help those people achieve success compared to when you're helping the people on their side of the world. But then, they would argue that international education represents reparations for colonialism. They carried this down the bench, but they never analyzed the response that we gave you right after the second speech. That it is simply another form of colonialism to take everyone that's smart out of a country and then educate them internationally in that other country. We would fundamentally disagree with the idea that this is a reparation for colonialism based upon the basic fact that you are not giving these countries the opportunity to improve their own education sector. Even more so, James took them at their best and still said that at that point, you would be helping them more with our side because you are repairing colonialism more so by ensuring that every single person in that country gets an education, compared to the world where only certain ones are. That's why, on the point of principle, if you want to vote with the more moral side, you are voting with our side. But let's move on to practical benefits. They tell you that the educated will come back and improve industries, but Liana told you that these people don't even come back on the large scale and improve education. Even more so, James took the best version of their argument and weighed it to make it really clear for you. They would give you a very small minority of students coming back and then investing in the education sector. We would give you an incentive for the entire government to stand up and realize they need to improve their education programs. At that point, you vote with our side because you make sure that the country is actually improving their education system, rather than relying on the whims of a few students who you really don't know what they will do. But next, they tell you that rich students are replaced by rich domestic students. James and Liana both explain why this is wrong because of our analysis on quotas. Now, they talked about this a little bit in their last few speeches, but even without giving you any new analysis, I can tell you why it still stands right now. They both told you that colleges want X amount of minorities and are fulfilling that based on international students. The alternative, when you can't take international students, is fulfilling that quota with minorities. Colleges simply want these minorities because they want to look good, just like James told you. They fulfill that, but they actually use real minorities who are struggling in our world. Finally, they gave you this exposure theory and said that international students are pretty much killing racism. But James absolutely dismantled this argument by telling you that people just see these international students as people stealing opportunities from you. So if anything, they just hate them even more. Finally, I want to compare our worlds. Understand that they conceded in this debate that international students are rich, and that was the linchpin of their case. Because at that point, they don't access the impact of helping the poor, and there is no incentive for the government to improve education because they would tell you that everyone coming back is coming back for their riches and that they are rich. Meanwhile, what do you get on our side? You get an incentive that the government has to improve education because now they can no longer rely on international schools. You also get the same benefit that they would provide you of international rich students getting an education. The difference is we would protect the stakeholder of minority students in the domestic country and the stakeholder of poorer students in the international country. On both frameworks, we simply weigh heavier.
I think all debaters for those remarks, I invite you to come to the aisle and shake hands and step outside, show them that it's time to dedicate. Thank you.
I guess we will have that. What did you say?